Inside the station, officers laughed, trading jokes at her expense. Reynolds joined in, still believing he was in control. But then, Maya spoke. "I need to make a call." The laughter faded. Something in her tone sent a ripple of uncertainty through the room. Slowly, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a badge. Not just any badge. FBI. Reynolds' smirk vanished. His hands, so steady moments ago, twitched. Lena, the room once filled with easy arrogance, fell silent. Maya met his stunned gaze, her voice calm, steady. "You just made the biggest mistake of your career." The town breathed an unspoken truth, a quiet but suffocating agreement, that some voices mattered more than others. It was the kind of place where history hadn't so much disappeared as it had been repackaged, dressed up in polite smiles and empty gestures. The storefronts were clean, the flags waved proudly, but beneath it all, the weight of something rotten pressed down, unseen but always felt. Maya had seen places like this before. She pulled into the gas station at dusk, her car rolling to a slow stop as she observed the world outside her windshield. A typical evening in a town that thrived on its own predictability, until something disrupted the pattern. Near the convenience store, a young black boy stood stiffly, his shoulders hunched like he was trying to make himself smaller. His fingers clutched the strap of his backpack, knuckles pale from the tension. In front of him, a white cop loomed, smirking as if he already knew how this conversation would end. Officer Reynolds. Maya recognized the type instantly. Self-assured, untouchable. The kind of man who believed his badge was a shield against consequence. He spoke with the casual cruelty of someone who had done this before, who knew his words could cut deeper than any weapon. "What are you doing here, huh?" His voice carried just enough amusement to make it worse. "Waiting for your dealer? Or maybe you already took what you came for?" The boy swallowed hard, his lips parting slightly, but no words came. Maya's hands tightened on the steering wheel. The bystanders moved with practiced indifference, eyes flickering toward the scene before quickly turning away. A woman pumped gas with stiff shoulders, a cashier inside the store made himself look busy, and a man walked past without so much as a glance. They all knew better than to interfere. The boy finally found his voice, though it was barely more than a whisper. I was just..." Reynolds let out a sharp chuckle, shaking his head. "Oh, now you want to talk? Funny how that works." He leaned in, lowering his voice as if offering some kind of wisdom. "See, you lot are all the same. Think you can stand around, make people nervous, and then cry when someone calls you out." Maya had heard enough. She pushed open her car door, stepping out into the cooling air. Her heart was steady, her movements precise. She approached with measured steps, neither rushed nor hesitant. The trick with men like Reynolds was never to let them sense urgency. "Officer," she said, her tone even, controlled, deliberately unimpressed. "Is there a problem here?" Reynolds turned, slow and deliberate, as if savoring the interruption. When his gaze landed on her, something flickered in his eyes. Curiosity, then amusement. Maya held her ground, waiting. The smirk came first, followed by the head tilt. "And who exactly are you, sweetheart?" Sweetheart. Maya had to fight the instinctive clench of her jaw. She knew what he was doing, testing her, baiting her. It was a familiar script, but she wasn't here to play his game. "I'm someone asking why you're harassing a kid for standing outside a store." Reynolds' expression shifted, the amusement cooling into something harder. He took a step forward, close enough that she could smell the coffee on his breath. "And I'm someone wondering why you think you get to question how I do my job." Maya met his stare without flinching. Silence stretched between them, thick and unrelenting. Around them, the town continued as if nothing was happening. Because to them, nothing was. This was routine. This was expected. The boy's breath was still uneven, his hands still tight on his backpack strap. Maya inhaled slowly. Then she turned her attention back to Reynolds, keeping her voice calm but firm. "I assume you have a reason to detain him?" Reynolds scoffed. "He's loitering." Maya raised an eyebrow. "Loitering?" "That's right." Reynolds crossed his arms, cocking his head. "You see, people around here don't like feeling unsafe, and this kid standing around with his hands stuffed in his pockets. Doesn't look too good. The boy's face burned, his eyes darting between them. Maya shifted slightly, just enough to position herself between the two. You do know standing outside a store isn't a crime, right? Reynolds exhaled sharply, his patience thinning. Lady, you really want to do this right now? Maya could feel the tension thickening, the air charged with something unspoken. But she had been in situations like this before, and she knew how to handle them. The key wasn't to react, but to force the other person to reveal themselves. She folded her arms, mirroring his stance. I'd like to know if this young man is free to go. Reynolds didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stared at her, weighing his options. He could escalate, try to intimidate her. But something about the way she held herself, the unwavering confidence, the lack of fear, made him hesitate. Finally, he huffed a breath and turned back to the boy. Get out of here! The teen blinked. What? You heard me. Reynolds waved a hand dismissively. Go. The boy hesitated only a second longer before clutching his backpack and taking off down the street. He didn't look back. Maya remained still as Reynolds turned his attention back to her. Happy now? She offered him the smallest of smiles. Getting there. Reynolds narrowed his eyes. He didn't like not knowing what she was, who she was, but for now he let it go. Maya did the same. For now. The moment Reynolds laid eyes on her, Maya could see it in his face. The assumption, the dismissal, the certainty that he had her figured out before she even opened her mouth. His smirk was thick with arrogance, his stance wide and imposing, as if he expected her to shrink beneath his gaze. Let me see some ID, he said, voice flat, indifferent. There was no question in it, no reason given, just a demand. Maya met his eyes, her expression unreadable. She had spent years perfecting the art of control, never giving men like him the satisfaction of a reaction. Slowly, she reached into her pocket, pulling out her wallet. Is there a reason you're asking for it? Her tone was calm, measured. Ranald chuckled, shaking his head as if she had just proven some unspoken point. Yeah. You're in the wrong place, sweetheart. He took the ID from her hand without even glancing at it. A few bystanders had stopped to watch, their faces unreadable. Some seemed uncomfortable, shifting their weight, avoiding eye contact. Others looked entertained, as if they had seen this show before and already knew how it ended. Reynolds held up the ID between two fingers, squinting at it like it was a puzzle too complicated to solve. Then, with a mocking grin, he flicked his eyes back to hers. Maya Caldwell. He let the name roll off his tongue, dragging it out as if he was searching for something familiar in it. Let me guess. You a lawyer or something? Maybe a cashier? Or, oh, you work at the hair salon? Maya didn't blink. Are you detaining me, officer? Reynolds' grin faded slightly. For a second, she saw the irritation slip through the cracks, the way his fingers twitched against her ID. He didn't like that she wasn't playing along. His lips pressed into a thin line. You're obstructing an officer, he said, slipping her ID into his pocket. Then, before she could respond, he grabbed her arm, twisting it behind her back as he shoved her against the hood of the patrol car. A murmur ran through the crowd, a few gasps, a couple of hushed whispers. But no one stepped forward, no one told him to stop. Maya felt the cold metal against her cheek, the rough grip of his fingers pressing into her wrist. She knew what he wanted, to humiliate her, to put her in her place, to remind everyone watching what happened when people like her stepped out of line. Should have just stayed quiet, Reynolds muttered. The cuffs clicked around her wrists. Across the lot, a woman pulled out her phone. A second later, another did the same. Someone was recording. Maybe more than one. Maya could hear the faint hum of a video starting, the quiet beeps of camera shutters. Reynolds didn't care. He yanked her up, gripping her arm as he guided her toward the patrol car. You're going to learn real quick how things work around here, he said, voice low enough for only her to hear. Maya didn't respond. She didn't fight. She didn't give him the reaction he was looking for. Instead, she let her eyes move slowly, deliberately, taking in every detail. The way his grip tightened when he spoke, the smirk playing at the corner of his mouth, the way his fellow officers chuckled through the radio when he called in backup. Got a little situation here, he said, his voice almost bored. Some mouthy troublemaker needed handling. The laughter crackled through the speaker. Maya sat stiffly in the back seat of the patrol car, her wrists still bound behind her. From here she had a perfect view of the station's front steps, the way officers lingered outside, swapping stories, laughing like nothing in the world could touch them. They didn't see her as a threat. That was their first mistake. Inside the station, Detective Marcus Gray sat in front of a monitor, watching the live feed from the patrol car's dash cam. The moment the name Maya Caldwell appeared on the report, something in his chest tightened. He knew that name, he had heard it before, and something about this entire situation felt wrong. His fingers hovered over his keyboard, hesitating. This wasn't just any woman, and whatever was happening, it wasn't over. Not yet. Reynolds shoved Maya into the cold, grey holding cell with a force meant to remind her that in his world, he was in control. The clang of the metal door echoed through the station, but Maya didn't flinch. She sat down slowly, composed, her expression giving away nothing. Across the room, Reynolds leaned against the desk, stretching like a man who had just won a long game. He chuckled as he turned to one of his fellow officers. "Bet she thought she could talk her way out of this one," he sneered. Laughter rippled through the room, low and mean. Maya kept her breathing steady, her hands resting lightly in her lap. Let them have their moment, she thought. It wouldn't last long. Reynolds continued his performance, his voice thick with condescension. "You know, I don't know what it is with people like her," he mused, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Always got something to say, always think they're smarter than the law." Another officer, a younger one who hadn't yet mastered the art of hiding his unease, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He didn't laugh, he just watched Maya as if sensing something was off. Maya finally spoke, her voice cutting clean through the air. "I need to make a call." It wasn't a plea, it wasn't even a request, it was a statement, simple and unwavering. Reynolds turned, a smirk playing at his lips. "Oh, you need to make a call?" he mocked. "And who exactly do you think you're calling?" Maya met his gaze, steady and unreadable. "Someone who's going to change the rest of your life." For the first time since this began, there was hesitation in Reynolds' face. It was brief, just a flicker, but Maya saw it. The room had shifted, and even the officers who had laughed before were quieter now, their curiosity outweighing their amusement. Reynolds scoffed, masking his unease. "Yeah, and what, you got some lawyer buddy who's going to come down here and—" Maya moved before he could finish. With slow, deliberate movements, she reached into the hidden pocket of her blazer. Every officer in the room tensed instinctively, hands twitching toward their holsters. But Maya wasn't pulling out a weapon, she pulled out a badge. The laughter died instantly. Reynolds' smirk collapsed as he stared at the small, shining emblem in her palm. For the first time, he looked uncertain. "I'm Special Agent Maya Caldwell," she said evenly, her voice carrying through the stunned silence. "FBI." Reynolds blinked. "You're lying." Maya didn't respond. Instead, she shifted her attention to the younger officer, the one who had been watching her closely. "Check the system," she said calmly. "My credentials are in your database." The young officer hesitated, then turned to his computer, fingers moving quickly over the keys. The tension in the room thickened with every passing second. Reynolds shook his head, still trying to process what had just happened. No, this is some kind of joke." Maya turned back to him, her expression unreadable. "Badge number 2176, she said. "You've been with this department for 6 years. In that time, you've racked up 11 excessive force complaints, 3 internal investigations, and a history of racial profiling that should have had you stripped of your badge years ago." Reynolds took a step back. The officers around him exchanged nervous glances. They had always known Reynolds was reckless, but this? This was something else entirely. The young officer at the computer swallowed hard. "She's telling the truth," he murmured. A thick, suffocating silence followed. Then the door to the station burst open. Within seconds, FBI agents flooded the room, their movements swift and purposeful. The station, once a place where men like Reynolds felt untouchable, was no longer theirs to control. Captain Harper stepped out of his office, his face pale. He took one look at the agents swarming his department and immediately knew this wasn't a situation he could talk his way out of. "Maya," he started, his voice low, almost pleading. She turned to him, eyes sharp. "Captain." Reynolds' breathing had turned shallow. He wasn't laughing anymore. "I was just doing my job," he blurted, desperation creeping into his voice. I didn't know who she was." Maya tilted her head slightly. "And that would have made it okay?" Reynolds opened his mouth, but no words came. Maya reached forward, clicking a button on the patrol car's dashcam monitor. The screen flickered to life, and the room filled with the unmistakable sound of Reynolds' own voice. "Took care of some mouthy troublemaker." The recording played on, each second further sealing his fate. Every word, every action, every abuse of power was right there, impossible to deny. Maya took a slow step closer, her voice quiet but unwavering. "I'll have your badge and your pension before sunrise." Reynolds finally understood. This wasn't just another arrest. This was the end. And this time, there was no way out. Reynolds stood frozen as the cold steel of the handcuffs snapped around his wrists. The irony didn't escape him. How many times had he done the same thing to others, wearing that same smug smirk? But now, there was no smirk, no power. Just the weight of the moment pressing down on him. His badge was unpinned from his chest with the same indifference he had once shown to the people he'd detained. It was over. The once confident officers who had laughed alongside him now kept their distance, avoiding his eyes. Not a single one came to his defense. The charges came swift and merciless: excessive force, unlawful detainment, obstruction of justice. Each word hit like a hammer, spelling out a fate he never thought would be his. "You can't do this," Reynolds growled, his voice low, desperate. "Oh, we can," the lead FBI agent responded, tightening the cuffs. "And we will." Maya stood in the corner, watching with quiet resolve. She didn't gloat, didn't celebrate. Justice wasn't about revenge, it was about accountability. As Reynolds was led past her, his eyes burned with anger. "You think this changes anything?" he spat. "You think they'll really turn against me?" Maya met his glare with unwavering certainty. They already have. And as Reynolds was dragged through the station, he saw the truth in her words. Officers who had once laughed at his jokes now looked away. The silence was damning. The investigation swept through the department like wildfire. One arrest had been the spark, but now the flames were exposing every hidden rot. The FBI's findings revealed what many in the community had long suspected. This wasn't about one bad officer. It was about a system that had protected him for years. Excessive force reports that had been lost. Complaints that had been buried under bureaucracy. Officers who had covered for each other, choosing silence over justice. Names were named, files were unsealed, careers ended overnight. Maya sat in a conference room, flipping through pages of reports, each one detailing another life ruined by unchecked power. She had always known corruption ran deep, but seeing it laid bare in black and white was something else entirely. Detective Marcus Gray stepped inside, his face tense. He hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I should have spoken up sooner." Maya closed the file and looked up at him. "You're speaking up now." Gray exhaled sharply. "I knew Reynolds was dirty, but I didn't realize how far it went. How much we let slide." He shook his head. "The things I've seen, the things I ignored." "You don't have to ignore it anymore," Maya interrupted. "But that's your choice." Gray's jaw tightened. A lifetime of looking the other way weighed on him, but something in Maya's presence made him feel like there was still time to do the right thing. He placed a flash drive on the table. "This has everything," he said. "Internal emails, deleted complaints, witness statements. It'll take down more than just Reynolds." Maya studied him for a long moment before nodding. This was bigger than one man. This was about dismantling a culture of silence. When Maya took the stand, the entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. The prosecutors guided her through the events of that night, but her testimony went beyond Reynolds. "This is not just about one officer," she stated, her voice steady. "It's about a system that allowed him to operate unchecked. It's about every report that went ignored, every victim that was silenced. It's about the people in power who decided that justice only applied to certain people." The words carried weight. People in the courtroom leaned forward, hanging on to every syllable. Reporters scribbled furiously, capturing each line for the headlines that would follow. Maya wasn't just speaking against Reynolds. She was speaking for every person who had ever been told to accept injustice as the norm. The case dominated the news. The footage of Maya's arrest played on every major network, forcing the town and the nation to confront a truth they had long tried to ignore. Protests filled the streets. Town hall meetings overflowed with citizens demanding change. Policies that had been untouched for decades were suddenly being rewritten. The mayor, once silent, was now issuing statements about police reform. The chief of police resigned under public pressure. The illusion of justice had been shattered, and there was no going back. Back home, Maya sat with her mother, Angela, as the evening news played in the background. Angela smiled, pride evident in her eyes. "You didn't just take down one bad cop," she said. "You forced an entire town to wake up." Maya exhaled, rubbing her temples. The weight of it all was still settling in. Angela reached over, squeezing her daughter's hand. "You did what I always knew you could do. You reminded them that justice doesn't belong to just one group of people." Maya swallowed hard, emotions threatening to rise. "It's not over," she murmured. "There are more out there, more like Reynolds, more systems built to protect them." Angela nodded. "I know, but you took the first step." Days later, Maya received an unexpected message. A simple email with a subject line, "Thank you." It was from the teenager at the gas station, the boy who had been harassed before she stepped in. "You showed me we don't have to be afraid," he wrote. "That people like me don't always have to keep their heads down, that fighting back is worth it." Maya closed her eyes for a moment, letting the words settle. She reached into her pocket, pulling out her badge. It gleamed under the dim light, heavier than it had ever felt before. This wasn't the end of the fight, but today was a victory.